The morning began ordinary, the kettle sighed, a dog padded across the tile, and sunlight cut across unpaid envelopes on the counter like thin, accusing lines. You opened your laptop because that is what you do: check the account, answer the messages, keep the small engine of life running. Then the call came, blunt as a winter branch against a window. "We're letting some people go," a voice on the other end said, perfunctory and final. Your name felt strange in that sentence, as if someone else were living in your life for a moment. You remember the kitchen light suddenly being too bright. Your partner standing in the doorway, eyes searching for a plan you didn't have. "What now?" she asked, not as accusation but as a naked, shared question that opened the room like a valley. Around you, familiar things, mugs, keys, the framed photo of a graduation, seemed to be waiting for an answer you couldn't produce. Bills became landscapes, every line item a mountain you had never intended to climb. In that hush, something else arrived, not thunderous revelation, but small, improbable nudges. A line from an old pastor, half remembered, a text from a friend who, oddly, had once lost everything and later smiled in a way that made suffering look like a teacher. A phrase whispered in a morning prayer you hadn't used in years: "Listen." It felt less like an instruction and more like an opening, as if a hand had put a compass back into your palm. Fear was immediate and cold, pride followed, stubborn and hot. You found yourself bargaining with memories of security, how long the cushion had been, why you'd believed it could never shift. Yet even as anxiety grew, each small message pulled at a different seam: the discipline you'd let slacken, the community you assumed was optional, the deeper purpose your work once served. Suddenly, wealth started to look broader than a balance sheet. It included time, clarity, the courage to ask for help. If this moment resonates, if the shock of a sudden loss pressed something awake inside you, stay with me. In the next part, we will walk through that first week after the fall, the sharp choices, the humiliations, and the first disciplined acts that begin to carve a new kind of abundance. If this touched you, give it a like, subscribe and ring the bell so we can keep uncovering these messages together. You wake before dawn, long after the house has gone quiet, and the silence feels less like peace and more like a question waiting in the dark. On the kitchen table, the envelopes stack like small storms, unpaid notices, polite but final letters, a mortgage statement that reads like a foreign language. Your hands are steady but your chest is tight. A voice, first flimsy, then clearer, whispers, "What now?" You answer it with a shrug and a groan, and the room replies with the hum of the refrigerator, the only steady rhythm left. Then the nudges begin, so small you almost miss them. A neighbor drops off a casserole and, while stirring the pot, says, "You should look at what you can save, not what you lost." The words are practical, not preachy, and they land. A book you bought years ago falls from the top shelf, you open it and find an underlined sentence: "True wealth begins with daily discipline, not a sudden windfall." Your phone buzzes with a text from someone you haven't spoken to in months, thinking of you. Lunch? The invitation feels like a lifeline. One night you dream of a voice, warm and unhurried. "This is not the end of your worth," it says. It is an invitation to redefine it. You wake with tears on your pillow, not from despair but from a strange mixture of grief and relief. Pride tightens, fear pushes. Yet each small message, advice from a coworker about budgeting, a pastor's offhand sermon about stewardship, a podcast episode on building multiple income streams, threads together into something that looks like a map. You begin to test these lessons. You mark every expense, not to punish yourself but to learn the language of your finances. You call a friend and admit, "I don't know how to start over." They answer without judgment, "Start with one small thing." Discipline becomes less like restriction and more like a muscle you can strengthen. Discernment grows when you turn down quick fixes that promise relief but steal long-term gains. Community appears in the form of a neighbor who babysits for a few hours, a mentor who reads your spreadsheet without blinking, a faith group that prays with you and points to purpose over panic. Each step is tender and precise, and the hush that once echoed with dread now holds a different tone, a patient, guiding presence. There are lessons here that money never taught you, and a test is coming that will ask whether you have truly learned them. If this resonates, like this video, subscribe and hit the bell, because next, those lessons will be sharpened by the first real trial. Morning leaks through the blinds as he sits at the kitchen table, the unpaid bills fanned like a small, accusing deck. The coffee has gone cold, the house hums with the ordinary noises of a life that no longer cares to reassure him. Then, almost before he realizes it, a voice, not loud, but clear, nudges him, begin with one thing. He looks up as if someone stood in the doorway, but there is only a neighbor on a bicycle, stopping to hand over a flyer for a free community workshop. Thought you might like this, she says, then rides away. The timing feels impossible. The flyer feels like an answer. He resists at first. Pride murmurs that accepting help is failure, fear warns against another disappointment. Yet that same small voice, the one he has started to name God in the hush of the night, keeps returning with practical pointers: inventory what you can truly control. Trim what you can postpone. Offer what you can give. He makes a list, not of losses now, but of skills, tools, contacts. The list is humble: a worn laptop, a knack for organizing, a neighbor who owes him a favor. Still, it is a beginning. At the workshop, a woman in her 50s with steady eyes says, "Discipline is not punishment, it's hospitality to your future." Her words land like a map. In the days that follow, he practices small disciplines. He tracks every coffee, every delivery. He negotiates a payment plan with a phone company and discovers the clerk on the other end becomes an ally once he speaks honestly. He meets a retired carpenter who offers to teach him how to repair furniture for quick sale. A youth pastor gives him a book and a verse that will not leave him, so with intent. Each gesture feels like a message in a bottle washed ashore, a sermon line turned practical, a stranger's kindness turned strategy. Fear doesn't vanish, but it sharpens into something useful: discernment. He begins to say no to quick fixes and yes to steady steps. In the quiet evenings, he prays not for guarantees but for clarity, and then acts on the clarity he receives. If this moment rings true, give it a heart, like it, subscribe and hit the bell so others can find these small, guiding messages. Ahead, the choices harden into tests, and the lessons begin to shape not only his bank balance but the man he is becoming. The days that follow feel like an education in the practical and the sacred at once. You sit at your kitchen table under the tired hum of a single bulb, bills fanned like a deck of decisions, the coffee gone cold. A voice, sometimes yours, sometimes like a whisper from somewhere beyond, says, "Begin where you are." So you begin, you write every expense, you call one creditor and hear a human on the other end say, "We can work with you." The smallness of those moments carves out a new vocabulary: discipline, not deprivation; discernment, not desperation. There are scenes that keep returning. A late-night conversation with a friend over chipped mugs. "Pride will keep you hungry," she says, and you laugh until you stop, because she is right. You take a temp job stocking shelves under fluorescent light and discover a rhythm in honest labor, the kind of pride that builds instead of breaks. You trade out lunches at cafes for sandwiches by the car, and each missed luxury becomes a deposit into tomorrow. The ledger grows steadier. The breath grows fuller. Messages arrive in many forms. At a community center, a woman taps your shoulder and hands you a pamphlet about financial coaching. "We've been there," she says. At church, an elderly man passes you a note that reads, "Find the work that fits your gifts." Those nudges sharpen into discernment: what obligations must be kept, what offers are traps dressed as opportunities, what relationships will support growth rather than drain it. You start to ask better questions, and the answers are quieter but truer. Setbacks come. A promised contract falls through, a bounced check humiliates you. You want to quit, to retreat into the safety of what you once had. But each setback polishes something inside: humility, patience, resolve. You learn to accept help without shame and to say no without guilt. Community becomes scaffolding: a neighbor lends tools, a former colleague recommends you for a freelance gig, a child hands you a hand-drawn good job note that melts every fear. Through discipline, discernment, community, and a renewed sense of purpose, the chaos changes shape. The crisis no longer defines you, it instructs you. If this part of the journey resonates, give it a like, subscribe and tap the bell, There is more to come, where faith and practical choices begin to rebuild not just a balance sheet, but a life that points beyond itself. The house smells of cold coffee and rain. You sit at the kitchen table under a single lamp, a stack of past due notices like small, accusing moons. The voice that arrived in the hush is not loud, it comes like a tide at your foot, steady and patient. It says nothing about miracles as much as it speaks of habits: wake early, list the tasks, honor the smallest payment. You hear it again, as if God is leaning close: discipline is not punishment, it is the scaffold for what you will build. The words land with surprising gentleness. Fear tightens in your chest, but pride loosens its grip. You begin to move. The first lesson feels almost prosaic: a strict budget, a daily ledger, a ration of expenses that feels like fasting but also like prayer. Morning light finds you at the desk, pen in hand, making promises to yourself you intend to keep. The second lesson arrives in a quieter form: discernment. Opportunities come, and the voice teaches you to test them. A well-meaning investor offers a quick fix, a friend suggests a risky shortcut. You remember the hush and learn to ask, does this align with how I must live, not just how I can survive? Decision becomes ritual, discernment becomes armor. Community emerges like a warm hearth in the storm. A neighbor leaves a casserole at your door and a fellow worshiper lends an old book on budgeting. In a small group meeting, an older woman places a steady hand on your shoulder and says, "You are not the ledger, you are the story behind it." Her faith is practical, she urges you to be accountable, to share failures and small wins alike. Humility grows in that admission. When you admit you don't have all the answers, others bring the missing pieces. Purpose begins to shape itself out of necessity. The voice that guided your spending now guides your vocation. What you once did to pay bills becomes, slowly, what you do to serve. You test a side project, you wake earlier to learn a new skill, you say no to what dazzles but costs your integrity. Each setback, a client who disappears, a proposal rejected, refines you rather than ruins you. You are learning to read the messages in the margins: discipline, discernment, community, purpose. And as those lessons settle into your bones, you realize the crisis is thinning you to what matters. If this resonates, continue with us, like this story, subscribe, and ring the bell. The next chapter shows how faith and steady choices rebuild more than a balance sheet. The morning light slices through the blinds like a truth you can no longer ignore. You sit at the kitchen table with last month's bills spread like a paper landscape of what went wrong. The voice you're learning to listen to, the small, steady counsel you once called chance and now name as guidance, says simply, start where you are. You pull a pen to a coffee-stained ledger and begin to name the numbers out loud, as if naming them gives you control. A memory surfaces, your father's hands folding a napkin into crisp edges, teaching you to save one coin before you spent another. That lesson, once dismissed as thrift, is now discipline reborn. You meet a neighbor at the community center. She is a former manager who lost more than you did but carries a calm like someone who's been remade by fire. Ask for one thing you can do today, she says, and the instruction feels like a roadmap. You call creditors, not to beg but to propose a plan. You barter skills, web design for childcare, cooking lessons for stationery, and every exchange is a small act of dignity. A text arrives from an old mentor: we don't recover money without recovering who we are. You read it 3 times, the words settling like seed in soil. Discerning which opportunities to chase becomes its own practice. You learn to say no to flattering offers that promise quick cash and yes to steady, values-aligned work that grows reputation and peace. Pride sits on your shoulder, whispering that asking for help is failure. You tell pride, aloud, this is not surrender. This is strategy. People respond. A tentative community fund covers a past due utility, a neighbor offers a lead that will become steady income. Each helper finds you, humility teaches you to accept, discernment teaches you to choose, and discipline keeps you showing up. There are setbacks, a client cancels, a setback that stings, but by now you've learned to measure progress by contour, not by single points. You begin to teach what you've learned in a small circle, translating pain into practical steps, and the act of teaching binds your wounds into purpose. If this part of the journey moved you, give it a like, share that emotional promise with someone who needs it. Subscribe and ring the bell. The next part will show how those daily choices start to rebuild not only your finances, but the very story you tell about who you are. Night had a way of sharpening everything: the quiet of the small apartment, the faint hum of the heater, the stack of unopened envelopes like a challenge on the kitchen table. He sat there with a single lamp, the numbers like a foreign language. Pride whispered, "You should have prevented this." Fear answered, "What if there is no way back?" Then, almost softly, a memory, his grandmother's voice saying, "When the river changes course, learn the new banks." That voice, that inexplicable nudge he'd started to call God, turned into a set of steady practices. Discipline was the first lesson. He stopped waiting for miracles and set alarms: wake early, track every dollar, call one person a day to seek advice or offer help. He learned to say no to instant comfort and yes to a plan that felt small but honest. Discernment arrived in the form of questions that cut through panic: which expenditures actually feed life? Which relationships lift you and which demand your last breath? At a coffee shop, a stranger, a retired teacher with calloused hands and a clear gaze, slid him a napkin with a single sentence: trade scarcity stories for service. That line became a compass. He began to barter skills with neighbors, tutor a teenager in math in exchange for babysitting, teach a workshop at the community center for a modest honorarium. Each exchange rebuilt confidence more than bank balance. Community proved to be a shelter and a furnace. A church group offered casseroles and a listening ear. Friends lent tools, not sympathy, and in return he offered time and sweat. When shame tried to pull him back into silence, a friend leaned in and asked, "What do you need me to believe about you?" The answer, that you are more than your balance, was the pivot. Setbacks came: a contract that fell through, a health scare, a proud relapse into old spending. But every setback polished him. He learned to treat failure as data, not destiny, adjusting budgets, improving skills, asking for help sooner. Small wins accumulated: a paid bill, a saved emergency week, a client who returned. Slowly, identity shifted from "I lost everything" to "I am learning to steward what remains." If this part of the journey strikes a chord, give this story a like as an affirmation, subscribe and ring the bell to continue. Next we'll follow how faith and deliberate choices rebuild not just finances but the self, turning recovery into testimony. The mornings changed first. Instead of rushing out the door with a travel mug and a practiced calm, you wake to the sound of a radiator clicking and the quiet of an apartment that no longer holds the same certainties. You find an old notebook on the kitchen table, pages of grocery lists, a margin scribbled that reads, "Start small. Start true." It feels like a message left by someone you love, or a note you left for yourself from a different season. That voice, soft, steady, begins to thread through the days: pay attention, simplify, give thanks for what remains. A week later, at a community pantry, you meet Rosa, a mother with laugh lines and an honesty that cuts through your defenses. Over coffee, she says, "When my husband lost his job, we learned to make a budget like a prayer: clear, repeated, trusted." You laugh and then cry because it's both funny and holy in its simplicity. Her household runs on envelopes and rules that feel boring until they feel like freedom. You borrow her method, and the first time you tuck cash into labeled envelopes, rent, food, repair, you feel a map forming under your hands. But discipline is not romantic. There are days when pride claws at you, when freelancing pays a fraction and a light on the phone blinks with unpaid notices. You are tempted by a quick scheme, a glossy ad promising fast returns. At night, lying awake, the same quiet voice answers, discernment before speed. You say no. Saying no becomes a practice as important as every small yes. You start declining high-risk work that smells like desperation and choosing steady projects that build reputation over time. Community becomes an engine. A neighbor lends a drill so you can fix a leaking cabinet, you trade hours teaching his daughter math. In a prayer circle at the church basement, someone reads a passage about stewardship, and tears roll down your face because it lands like a blueprint for dignity. Each setback, an unexpected vet bill, a client late with payment, bends you but does not break you. The lessons sharpen: patience, prudence, covenantal generosity. If this is resonating, know the next steps will be practical and deliberate. Like this story if it moved you, so it can reach another weary heart. Subscribe and tap the bell to walk with me into rebuilding decisions that honor faith and create lasting prosperity. The next scene takes you from learning to concrete action, the first deliberate choice that changes everything. The months after the tremor were not cinematic rescues but quiet, patient work. Mornings at the kitchen table with a single lamp, the warm hum of a kettle, envelopes spread like a small, honest map of what needed tending. He traced numbers with a thumb as if reading scripture, each line a sentence in the new language he had to learn: budget, negotiate, say no without shame. A knock at the door. Maria from down the street, who once borrowed sugar and now borrowed time, handed over a casserole and a look that said, "I know. We'll swap labor for groceries," she said, pragmatic and tender. They traded evenings repairing a fence for staples, small debts repaid in laughter and shared stories. Community became currency. There were nights of doubt when pride rose like a tide. "I should have known better," he murmured into the darkness. A soft reply turned inward like a prayer: "You are not what you lost." That voice, sometimes a memory of counsel at the church, sometimes an inner insistence, kept returning with practical commands dressed as mercy: discipline before abundance, discernment before risk, patience before vanity. He began to practice them. He tracked where every dollar went, cut luxuries that had become habit, apprenticed himself to discipline as if to a wise mentor. An opportunity arrived not as a windfall but as a doorway swung open, a small contract through a friend, an evening class that taught him how to monetize a skill he'd taken for granted. He said yes with a mixture of terror and relief, accepting labor that honored his dignity. He learned to ask for help and to give it back, teaching a neighbor to budget, sharing a tool, offering a quiet encouragement. Each act rebuilt trust, with banks, with employers, with the reflection in the mirror. There were setbacks, a late payment, a project that stalled, and each one polished a new kind of courage. The crisis that once threatened to define him had become a classroom, the teacher's faith and practice. By the time spring edged the windows with light, his hands knew how to plant not just seeds for tomorrow's food but seeds of legacy, a small emergency fund, a jest of generosity saved for someone behind him. If this resonates, stay with me. In the next chapter I'll walk you through the exact practical steps and spiritual habits that turned scarcity into testimony. If this story is moving you, give it a like, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the blueprint that could change your path. You wake before dawn, the kitchen light a single halo over a coffee mug still warm from midnight calculations. Rain hisses against the window like a crowd of small questions. You run your finger along the margin of the last unpaid bill and hear, not in a voice that startles you, but as a steady insistence, look for what you can steward, not what you've lost. That whisper, soft, uncompromising, becomes a map. You fold the papers, make a list, and call the person you were too proud to call last week. "Can we talk?" your partner asks, voice thick with weariness. You sit across from each other at the table that has borne birthdays and arguments, and you speak the new truth. "We're going to change how we live. We'll keep the lights on and we'll build a life that matches what we now believe we can be." The promise isn't mystical, it's practical: a budget, a pared-down rhythm, a small side job that begins as a bandage and becomes a skill. Outside, the neighborhood church doors open for a community workshop. You go more for warmth than doctrine, and leave with hands on a pen and a ledger, taught by someone who has walked ruin and repair. "Discipline is the doorway," she says. "Generosity is the path." You find yourself volunteering 2 hours a week, teaching basic budgeting to someone younger, listening to a single mom whose courage humbles you. As you give, you receive a new lens, abundance measured in usefulness. Setbacks keep coming, an unexpected repair, a client who doesn't pay, but each one is smaller than the shock that began this story. You learn to name fear without worshipping it. You learn to convert pride into curiosity. Instead of proving you can do it alone, you ask, "Who can we do it with?" The inner messages sharpen: save a little, invest a little, forgive debts where you can, and protect your heart from definitions tied purely to numbers. Small victories stitched together, the first month without overdraft, a repaired relationship, a saved emergency fund. Your recovery is not a ledger closed but a testimony being written, one you can tell at the next gathering, in a message that begins, "I thought this was the end, it was the beginning." If this part of the journey moved you, tap like and subscribe with the bell. There's practical, step-by-step rebuilding coming next, the blueprint that turned these lessons into an enduring legacy. You sit at that same kitchen table, the one scarred by coffee rings and late-night calculations, and the room feels different now, not because the wallpaper changed but because you do. The bills are still there, but so is a ledger of choices, disciplined savings, a conversation you were brave enough to have, a small business idea sketched on a napkin that became a side income. A voice, quiet at first, kept cutting through the clutter, "This is an invitation, not an end." You remember saying out loud to the empty room, "What now?" and then hearing an answer in the rhythm of your own steady breath, in a neighbor's unexpected help, in a scripture line you had read 100 times but never made practical. Enough, the message seemed to say. Rise. You learned to read abundance in new ways, in the discipline of a daily budget, in the discernment to say no, in the community that showed up with casseroles and job leads. There were nights when fear tried to reclaim you. Pride whispered that asking for help would undo you. But a friend sat across the table and simply said, "Tell me what you need," and that simple offer became a turning point. You rebuilt slowly, each small victory a brick in a life that no longer rests only on income but on purpose. Now your recovery is testimony, a quiet pastor nodding as you share, a neighbor pausing to listen, a child watching you refuse scarcity and choose generosity. If this story stirred something inside you, promise yourself one thing: keep listening. If this touched you, press like, let that small click be a testament that you choose hope today. Subscribe and ring the bell so we can walk the next steps together, practical habits, faith-filled decisions, and real testimonies that make rebuilding possible. Which financial crisis shaped you, and how could it be the doorway to your own testimony? If you're ready, there is more to explore. Next, we'll unpack the first 3 practical actions that turn loss into legacy.